Hello, welcome to the channel. I'm speaking with David Shinn, who is an adjunct professor of international affairs at the Elliott School of International Affairs at George Washington University in Washington, D.C. During the Clinton administration, he served as the U.S. ambassador to Ethiopia from 1996 to 1999. David is also a frequent commentator in the international news media on political issues and has provided consultancy to the U.S. government on Horn of Africa related affairs. David has contributed passages to many publications related to African affairs and continental relations with China. I'm pleased to have Ambassador Shinn on the channel. Welcome back.
Thank you, George.
I'd like to start with the situation in Ethiopia. In November of 2022, peace was finally achieved between the Ethiopian federal government and the Tigrayan regional government, who had been at war for the past 2 years. The African Union was involved in facilitating peace talks and establishing confidence-building measures by which the two parties could resolve immediate issues related to the war and set the path forward for the future. So first, I'd like to ask, what reaction do you have to the cessation of hostilities signed in Pretoria and later Nairobi? Will this peace last?
Of course, you're asking the same question that everyone is asking, and it's a very important question. Let me put it this way. I'm somewhat optimistic that the peace will last. I'm a little more optimistic today than I was a month ago, simply because the peace has gone on this long, which is a good sign. Now, I think there are at least two reasons why we saw a peace agreement between the central government in Ethiopia and the Tigrayan forces. On the Tigrayan side, they were experiencing serious military hardship. They were being pressed very, very hard by both the central government forces and the Eritrean forces. And I think they saw that they were losing too many people, including civilians, and too much damage was being done to Tigray region. So they had a great incentive to try to come to a peace agreement and end this conflict with the central government. But on the central government side, you had a different dynamic going on. The economy of Ethiopia was failing badly and is frankly in very difficult straits. The currency has been badly damaged. I think when you finally get GDP numbers for 2021 and 2022, they're going to be very disappointing. So they had an incentive to bring this to an end because of the failing economy. And as a result, you had an agreement in South Africa and then the follow-on discussions in Kenya. The big question is, what about the Eritrean forces? Their situation is very, very different. And they, as far as I know, they still have forces inside Tigray. I think there are reports that some of them have left. That's a good thing. But it's not clear what Eritrea's position is on all of this. The fighting has taken place in Tigray. That's where the damage has been. It's not been inside Eritrea. So even though I think they lost a lot of soldiers in the fighting, they didn't have their country damaged to the extent that Tigray did. So that is my one outstanding concern going forward, and that is the position of Isaias Afwerki. Is he going to allow this peace agreement to hold? And if he does, then I think it will hold. If he doesn't, then we have another problem.
And of course, earlier in the conflict, many analysts criticized the lackluster role of the African Union and their perceived partisan stance in favor of Ethiopia. But they've been able to bring the two sides together. How important is that, that they've been able to bring both Tigray and Ethiopia to the negotiating table? And what does it say about the role of African institutions in mediating war?
Well, I think it's critically important that they were able to bring the two parties together. And I'm very pleased that it was an African organization that achieved this and not a foreign organization. I think it was instrumental in bringing the former Kenyan president into the process. I think that increased the trust on particularly on the Tigrayan side in the process. I think they were suspicious or concerned about the role of the former president of Nigeria, and I'm not sure how important a role South Africa was playing at that point. But the combination of bringing the South Africans and the Kenyans into the process made, I think, a huge difference from the standpoint of providing more trust, especially from the Tigrayan side. And it also speaks well for the African Union. So far, anyway, this is a real achievement for the African Union. And it shows that they took the initiative, they worked hard, and they have stopped the fighting. And so long as that fighting remains stopped and you don't have people being killed, you have real progress. So my hat's off to the African Union for achieving what it has done so far, and I only hope that it continues to hold.
And the reaction to the peace deal was welcomed across the African continent, with praise for the leadership to resolve their issues diplomatically. But if peace was always an inevitability between the two, why did it take 2 years of war to get to this point?
Well, that's a good question. I would go back to the point that I made at the outset, in that you had a situation in the first 2 years of the conflict, or almost 2 years of the conflict, where I think each side thought it could win militarily. And they learned eventually that there would really be no military victory. Even if the central government and the Eritrean forces defeated the Tigrayan forces in conventional battle, the Eritrean forces would probably just go back into the hills of Tigray and carry on a guerrilla activity that would constantly be a thorn in the side of the federal government. And I think the federal government probably understood that and realized that it was just not in its interest to do that anymore. And as I said earlier, because of the failing economy in Ethiopia, it too wanted to bring this to an end. And it was kind of a question of a mutually hurting stalemate between the central government forces and the Tigrayan forces for very different reasons. And the two sides decided simultaneously to bring it to an end.
Well, one of the new major issues that the conflict introduced is the contested areas that comprise Western Tigray. Disputed territories of Wolkite, Humera, Raya, among others, are now being claimed by both Amhara and Tigray regional states. What would be an ideal scenario for this problem to be negotiated?
Well, clearly it has to be a negotiated settlement. There are arguments that can be made, I think good arguments, from both the standpoint of the Amhara region on the one hand, which is more or less represented by the central government, and on the Tigrayan side on the other hand. So it has, basically you have to have compromise. You have to have a willingness by the Tigrayan side and the Amhara / central government side to sit down, talk through these issues, and each side is going to have to give up something. I don't know what. It's going to depend upon historical issues on the one hand. It's going to depend upon more recent developments on the other. You're going to have to combine those, and there just is going to have to be a willingness to accept some change by both sides.
Well, interestingly enough, Eritrea was not mentioned by name in the cessation of hostilities agreement, nor were they mentioned in the peace talks. Rather, the term non-ANDF forces was used to describe them and the Amhara regional forces. No Eritrean representative was present at the talks either in Pretoria or in Nairobi. What do these facts tell you about the Eritrean government's role in the conflict and their objectives in Tigray? Were they generally interested in ending the conflict?
I question whether Eritrea genuinely wanted to end the conflict. I think Eritrea's interest in this from the beginning has been to weaken Tigray to the maximum extent possible, because a weaker Tigray, as seen by the Eritrean government, is a less threatening organization at some point in the future, particularly the TPLF. So I'm not convinced that that Eritrea found it in its interest to bring this conflict to an end. And that's what worries me about going forward. Although the active fighting seems to have ended involving the Eritrean forces, at least I have not seen reports of it. As I indicated, my understanding is there still are Eritrean forces in Tigray. They don't seem to be in any great rush to return to Eritrea, and they could be reactivated at any time if the Eritrean government decided to activate them.
And one part of the agreed concessions is that armed units that comprise the Tigrayan regional military will disarm concurrent with Eritrea's withdrawal from Tigray. And it seems that this has started, but it's incomplete. If it remains so, would Ethiopia put pressure on Eritrea to withdraw completely?
Well, clearly, the departure of the Eritrean forces is critical to the total disarmament of the Tigrayan forces. I can't imagine that the Tigrayan forces will completely disarm so long as Eritrean forces remain inside Tigray. Quite frankly, if I were a Tigrayan, I wouldn't do that. I mean, it would be suicidal for the Tigrayan militias and armed forces to completely disarm. It seems as though there has been a partial disarmament, at least of some of the conventional weapons. It's very difficult to know exactly what has been turned over to the central government of Ethiopia. I have the distinct impression that there's a reasonable amount of trust between the central government and the Tigrayan forces, but I don't think there's much trust between the Tigrayan forces and the Eritrean forces. So it really is completely dependent now upon the Eritreans. It's sort of their move. If they continue to withdraw from Tigray, as they apparently started to do, that will be a very good thing. If they don't, then there are going to be more difficulties.
Well, what would incentivize the Eritrean government to start some sort of negotiated process with Tigray or with Ethiopia more generally to allow the peace deal to be fully implemented? Is there any scenario in which the Eritrean government would facilitate peace talks rather than continue on this sort of bellicose stance that they've preferred?
Well, I don't know what's going on in the heads of the Eritrean leadership, so it's really difficult to answer that question. I think it's important, if it has not already been done, for the Ethiopian government to make very clear to the Eritrean government that it wants the Eritrean forces to leave Ethiopia. That is step number one. I have no idea what what Abiy Ahmed or other members of the Ethiopian government have said to the Eritreans. Maybe they have already done that. Maybe they haven't done it. If they haven't done it, I think it's critical that they do so. If the Eritreans think they are still welcome inside Tigray, at least in the minds of the Ethiopian government, I doubt if they're going to leave. So step number one is simply making sure in Addis Ababa that they have made clear to the Eritrean government that it's time to go home. If after having done that, it does not happen, then you get to the point where either more pressure has to be brought to bear on the Eritreans. Maybe they're waiting for some kind of promises from the Tigrayans or from the government in Addis Ababa. I don't know. It's just very, very difficult, I think, to predict or to indicate what needs to be done without knowing what is going on in the minds of Isaias Afwerki.
Well, of course, with all these developments occurring throughout Ethiopia these past 2 years, International media has yet to go inside Tigray to do accurate and sustained investigative reporting on the situation, which has been a contributing factor to not only the lack of coverage, but the lack of a response. It seems over time that the issue of Tigray has felt less important and urgent, with no media to emphasize the significance of the war. How instrumental was it that the media blockade by the Ethiopian government has been in influencing the public's perception of the war in the country and worldwide?
Well, I think it had a major impact. And as you rightly point out, the international media was prevented from going into Tigray. In fact, it's not even clear to me today whether the international media is welcome inside Tigray. I see so few reports from the international media on developments inside Tigray that I have the impression that they're not yet welcome in that region. And it seems to me that now that the fighting has stopped, it would be to the advantage of certainly the Tigrayan government and the government in Addis Ababa to allow them in to report independently what is happening on the ground. But for whatever reason, that seems not to have happened. And this, you put your finger on a critical issue here. I think there would be a great deal more, not only understanding of what's happening on the ground, but there would be more willingness to accept as fact what the different parties are saying about the situation on the ground. How much humanitarian assistance is in fact reaching the people in need in Tigray? It seems that it is moving into the region. We hear that from the non-governmental organizations and international aid agencies, but we don't have a very good idea where exactly it's going once it gets to Mekelle. So it's essential that international media be allowed in at this point.
We'll briefly compare Tigray to the conflict in Ukraine, with almost nonstop coverage of the war, dedicated segments to Ukraine on newspapers and websites around the world, overt Ukraine solidarity, even here in the United States. We saw recently President Volodymyr Zelensky give an address to Congress. Um, the people of Ukraine won Times People of the Year award last year. Of course, understanding the implications of Russia's attack comes with the possibility of global diplomatic and military involvement. How would you describe the difference in approaches of the media in reporting these two world events, and how does the US weigh the severity of the implications that Tigray and Ukraine bring onto the world stage?
Well, there's a big difference in terms of access. In the case of the war in Ukraine, it was in the interest of the Ukrainian authorities to allow as much international media into the country as possible in order to publicize the fact that the Russians really were invading the country and blowing the place up, because they got an enormous amount of positive publicity out of that. Now, there was not a great deal of reporting from the Russian side, but the action was in Ukraine. That's where all the fighting has happened, not in Russia. So you had a very different circumstance in Ukraine in terms of media activity, where they were essentially prohibited from going into Tigray. They were welcomed in the Ukraine. That makes for a huge difference. Now, there's probably also something of a bias in the media where European issues just get more and better reported than African issues. I'm afraid that's a fact of life that one has to live with. But I think the bigger distinction is Ukrainians encouraged the coverage, and the Ethiopian government prohibited the coverage.
And what does the role of the media suggest about conflicts that don't receive much attention? Does it influence the attitudes and decisions when drafting policy, for instance?
There's no doubt, but what it does have an influence. It also creates much more room for rumors, for misinformation, for propaganda, for all the stuff that is unhelpful in a conflict situation. I'm not suggesting that the international media always gets it right. It doesn't. It makes mistakes too. But it tends to be more in-depth and more accurate reporting than you hear from either side to the conflict. I don't recall that there was much that I relied upon during the actual fighting coming from either the Tigrayan side or the Addis Ababa side. And we didn't hear really anything from the Eritrean side. They were in a silent mode for 2 years. So one was sort of at the mercy of the occasional report that you got from the human rights organization, from a non-governmental organization, from an international aid agency, or sometimes you get a fairly good report from someone on the ground who was speaking to someone outside of Ethiopia. But that was rare, and there you could never totally rely upon those reports either.
Well, social media company Meta is now facing a potentially $1.6 billion lawsuit in its sub-Saharan office in Kenya, where Facebook's recommendation systems amplified hateful and violent posts in the context of the war in Tigray. Edited images, hate speech, reposted videos, and unconfirmed rumors spreading throughout the worst atrocities of the conflict have split communities, even in the Eritrean and Ethiopian diaspora. How would you describe the effects that social media has had on the conflict in Ethiopia?
I think it's had a generally detrimental effect on the conflict, as you suggest, in terms of this court case against Facebook. They allowed an awful lot of material on their platform to be broadcast, to be sent around the world that was not helpful, and that was often inaccurate, and some of it was hate speech. No platform should ever allow hate speech. I don't care who it is or what it is. That is strictly unhelpful to society, and the organization that is in charge of allowing that to happen should shut it down, and shut it down quickly. I realize it's very hard to do that. The way these platforms work, people can move very quickly and put material on, and there's a lag time in shutting it down. But if that lag time goes on for an excessive amount of time, then the platform, I think, is liable for these kinds of actions. And I don't know what's going to happen with the Facebook case, but it may be a good lesson for them and others that you have to shut this hate speech down. Misinformation is harder to deal with. Sometimes you have to have experts on the scene to determine what is informed reporting and what is misinformation. And everyone will occasionally get that wrong.
Well, recently, Ethiopia Insight published an interesting article which describes how Ethiopian culture affects decision making. They stated that foreigners should consider three factors when having conversations with Ethiopians. First is that Ethiopians tend to see things in black and white, resulting in little flexibility. Second, Ethiopians look to their leaders to distinguish friends and enemies. And thirdly, to assess the veracity of information, Ethiopians ask not only if it supports their narrative, but if it opposes and undermines their foes. First, how do you react to this? Can this be applied to other experiences you've had in Africa during your time when working with the U.S. Foreign Service?
Well, let me put it this way. It certainly can apply to my time in Ethiopia. I read the Ethiopia Insight piece. I thought it was a good piece. I agree 100% with the idea that Ethiopians see things in black and white. And I experienced this in my own time in Ethiopia during the Eritrean-Ethiopian War. I may have made this point when we spoke several months ago, but it's probably worth repeating. It certainly left a very indelible impression in my mind. But during that war, the Ethiopian government thought that the United States was not supporting it 100%, and therefore it was supporting Eritrea. And I encountered that reaction for months in Addis Ababa. But at the same time, I know that my counterpart in Asmara had exactly the same problem. The Eritrean government did not think that the United States was supporting the Eritrean government, sufficiently, and therefore the U.S. government was completely in the pocket of Ethiopia. So we both had the same problem for essentially the same reason. And I think because the cultures in both Eritrea highlands and the Ethiopian highlands are pretty much the same. Uh, both sides see the issue in black and white, as the Ethiopian Insight article made clear, or take the position that if you don't support me 100%, then you obviously are against me. That's not the way Americans operate. We tend to give and take, and we see the good and the bad in a lot of these situations. We see the need to compromise, to yield somewhat. I find that in the Ethiopian highlands, and I suspect it's also true in the Eritrean highlands, there isn't really much interest in compromising. It's just not part of the culture, and this is far greater the case in the highlands of both countries. It's less true in the lowlands. If you get into Somali culture or some of the lowland Oromo culture, for example, or Benishangul, I did not encounter the same kind of reaction, and nor did I encounter it in all of my other assignments in Africa, and I had a lot of them. There was more willingness usually to compromise everywhere else I served in Africa.
And secondly, isn't this what builds mistrust and eventual hostility, the way that we saw in 2020 between Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed and the TPLF leadership?
Yes, it does. It clearly creates the mistrust.
So I'd like to switch the top of our conversation to the recent US-Africa summit, which was hosted by President Biden in December of 2022 in Washington. Leaders from 49 African countries and the head of the African Union attended the summit. Countries suspended by the African Union, of course, did not attend, including Sudan, Mali, Guinea, Burkina Faso, as well as Eritrea, because of its lack of diplomatic relations with the US. Although President Biden did not sit individually with any one leader in particular, a photo was taken afterwards to show the camaraderie that the United States has with African countries. Now, Ambassador Shinn, this was the first US-Africa summit since the inaugural meeting was held during the Obama administration in 2014. Why do you think that President Biden decided now was a good time to invite African countries to Washington?
I think that the Biden administration had the intention of holding a conference like this from the very beginning. But as probably can understand, all kinds of intervening problems tend to slow these programs down, or these schedules down, and not the least of which has been the war in Ukraine. So it took almost 2 years in order to actually consummate it. It also takes a long time to organize one of these events. My guess is the organization probably began about a year ago. So you essentially had 1 year where nothing happened on it. And then the next year was the organizational phase and the actual event itself. I think that explains it more than anything else. And during the Obama administration, it actually happened much later into his administration than it did with the Biden administration. I think Biden was committed to this from the very beginning. And he did announce at the conference that he would be visiting Africa sometime this year. I haven't heard any more about that. I don't know what countries he's going to, but I suspect in the coming month or two, we will hear more.
Well, some important takeaways, as you mentioned from the session, included the US's support for the African Union to become a member of the G20, a promise of about $55 billion in aid to Africa over the next 3 years, and a personal commitment from President Biden to visit Africa in 2023. Are these goals feasible for the Biden administration to accomplish? Should the US be doing more or less? What would you recommend?
Well, the goals are certainly feasible. The United States alone cannot determine whether the AU becomes a member of the G20, for example. There are other parties that must agree to that. But obviously, the United States and China, too, has said it favors that decision, need to agree that this is something that should happen. The the one issue that we need to watch very carefully is the $55 billion package over the next 3 years. And I still have not seen a detailed elaboration of what that is. I hope that at some point in the coming weeks, that will be spelled out a little more clearly what is in that package. My understanding is that a lot of it will be health money that was probably in the pipeline anyway, for things like combating HIV, AIDS, and malaria, where the United States has been one of the major providers of assistance over the years. And a lot of it, I suspect, will be humanitarian assistance, which has also been in the pipeline. But it does highlight the fact that the United States has been doing a lot of aid to Africa nonstop ever since the end of the Cold War. And I'm not sure that the U.S. has gotten a great deal of credit for that, but it's a fact of life that we have been the major provider of humanitarian assistance and probably the single largest provider of health assistance over the last 30, 40 years. So I expect to see a lot of that in this $55 billion package, but I would like to see some new things. And some were announced at the conference. They were not huge dollar items, but there were a fair number of them, and they do add up. But we need to have a schedule laid out as to what all is in the $55 billion package.
Well, the Biden administration's financial commitments to Africa seem to be tied towards development goals reached for the people in the sectors of health, agriculture, water, and infrastructure. With this comes the expectation that the African governments who accept this money are willing to meet the standards of governance that will allow them to facilitate growth expected by the US. But oftentimes, aid is not used as specified, and also some of the conditions are vague. One example that I could cite going back to connect this to the Tigray conflict is Ethiopia's withdrawal from AGOA. They were actually suspended due to their violations of the agreement in 2021. What measures did the U.S. take to assure that aid is used properly, and what impacts can it have for relations that it has with other African countries?
This is always done on a case-by-case basis, and I must confess that it's not always done with enormous consistency. There will be instances where aid continues to some countries that remain highly authoritarian or have other serious human rights faults. There will be other countries where leverage is used to ensure or try to ensure that there be improvements in the governance of the country or in the human rights practices of the country, where maybe the practices are even less egregious. So unfortunately, this is not always a consistent process. And the only thing I can really say about it is that it is done on a case-by-case basis. For example, the current situation between Eritrea and the United States is not good. We all know that. We do have diplomatic relations. We have an embassy in Asmara. There's no ambassador there, but we do have an embassy with a charge d'affaires. But it's not a good relationship, and it's for that reason that President Isaias was not included in the conference in Washington. He may not have attended even if he had been invited, quite frankly. But the point is that going forward, you can be assured that Eritrea will not be high on Washington's list for any of this new assistance that will go to the continent. I think if Eritrea has a drought, a serious drought, and people are dying or in harm's way, the threat of dying as a result of inadequate food supplies, the United States would probably be the first with the most to come in and try to help out. But in terms of other kinds of assistance, I doubt if you're going to see it in a country like Eritrea, because there are real concerns about the governance process there. And the same will apply with every country in Africa. It will be looked at individually and decisions made. Is this a country that we want to put a lot of effort into or not? And that may not be the best way to operate, but it's the way the U.S. operates. And for better or worse, that's, I'm afraid, the way it's going to be.
Well, of course, during the time between the two summits, China's role in Africa has increased substantially. China's increased diplomatic presence across Africa is notable with the promotion of the Belt and Road Initiative. How does one see the US and China in its efforts to continually build their relations with African countries?
Well, I must say I was a little frustrated during the Africa Leaders Summit in Washington, and getting all of these media calls to comment on the event in Washington. And the only thing that they usually wanted to talk about is how does this impact China's engagement in Africa? And the administration was trying very hard to avoid just that. In fact, I don't think President Biden mentioned China a single time during the entire conference. Now, in the background, it's true. You do have the element of China in Africa, and to a much lesser extent, the role of Russia. The Russian role in Africa is quite minor compared to China's engagement on the continent. And the United States is not going to ignore the role of China in Africa. But I think the Biden administration is sincerely trying to make this a U.S. Africa policy, not a U.S. policy in Africa focused on what China is doing. They just don't see it that way. And the United States has said on numerous occasions that there may even be cases where China and the United States can cooperate in Africa. We did in the past. That this is not unique to the relationship, but in the last probably 10 years, 7 to 10 years, that has pretty much disappeared. I'd be hard pressed to identify instances of China-U.S. cooperation in Africa, but it could return in spite of the rather sour relationship today between the United States and China.
There's this perception, Ambassador Shinn, that China's relations with Africa are mutually beneficial and that Western countries are trying to take advantage of Africa for economic purposes based on the legacy of the slave trade, and that there's a racist view on Africans. But meanwhile, China has signed on African properties, goods, and companies, leaving countries in debt traps. In addition, China has also been known to bring its own labor force to work on projects in Africa. So, can it really be said whether the US or China is a better suitor for African countries? Is there a better option to look for foreign support, or should African countries commit to one another first?
Well, clearly each African government is going to have to make that decision on its own, and different governments are going to come to different conclusions. There will be some governments who will tend to favor a relationship with Western countries generally, including the United States. There will be others, for whatever reason, that will prefer a closer relationship with China than with the Western countries. But let me comment on this issue of racism, because it comes up frequently. There is no country in the world that has been able to avoid the problem of racism to one degree or another. Certainly the United States has not avoided it, but nor has China, nor has any other country in the world, including even African countries in their own way. It's a different type of racism, not necessarily based on skin color, but based on other elements. It may come out more in the context of ethnicity or tribalism, but it's still a form of racism when you get right down to it. So we're all guilty of this, and to try to argue that one country is less guilty than another, I think is kind of a fool's errand. So I basically leave the racism question at that. I would also make the point that all countries, certainly including the US and China, are pursuing their own interests wherever they are operating, whether it's Africa or some other part of the world. They're not looking after the interests of Africa, if we're talking about Africa. They're looking out after their own interests. And China's no different. The US is no different. They may try to give the impression that they're more interested in the interests of the other side, but that's just not the way foreign policy works. Everyone's out for their own interest.
Well, China's apathetic view towards democratic styles of government have allowed it to make deals with authoritarian regimes. Considering the political longevity that Chinese require for their plans to be successful, is it a sustainable form of diplomacy for them to be supporting or at least catering to the needs of these sorts of governments?
China has something of an advantage in terms of the way its government is organized, in that the Communist Party has been in total control since 1949. There's never been any real serious challenge to the Communist Party of China. And even though the leadership changes, you have different personalities who will be in charge of the party, in charge of the government every 10 or more years. The party doesn't change. So that does allow them to do more long-term planning than, say, the United States is able to do, because we change every 4 years. Now, it may be that the same leader stays in power for 8 years, but there's constant change going on in the United States. And as a result, the United States is not very good at long-term planning, both for domestic purposes and in terms of its foreign policy. So in this sense, China really does have an advantage. But I think it's difficult even for a country like China to project future plans when you have these what we call black swans, or these unknown elements impact what is happening in a country. And in the case of China, it was COVID-19. COVID-19 really caused difficulties for the entire world, including China. And if you look, for example, at China's engagement with Africa during COVID-19, most of it dropped off dramatically. The only thing that has recovered so far has been trade. Trade was at a high point in 2016. It then took a significant drop, and it did come back to where it was in 2016, even surpassed it in 2021. But otherwise, almost everything that China was doing in Africa has declined, in large part because of COVID-19. There also were other factors. And no one can predict a COVID-19 or the next bad thing that comes along. And it's going to impact not only China, but every country in the world.
Well, what action steps does the United States need to take beyond a 3-day summit for them to be desirable for African governments and markets in the future? Does the US need to take on Africa more seriously?
Well, one, they need to be more persistent. As you imply, you can't do this with a 3-day conference and then go on to the next shiny object. You have to be persistent in maintaining that relationship with, in this case, with Africa. Now, to the extent that President Biden has announced that he's going to be making a visit to Africa, that will help. That will certainly underscore the desire of the administration at very high levels to maintain an ongoing interest in what's happening on the continent as they prepare for this visit. But it has to be more than that. It has to be a whole of government approach involving all of the bureaucratic organizations of the government. And we'll just have to wait and see whether that happens. There have been occasions in the past where I think the US was pretty good about having a whole of government approach towards Africa. There are other occasions when it was not so good. And the Biden administration just has to ensure that it improved that process.
Well, Ambassador Shinn, I'd like to give you the final word.
Well, I guess I would go back to Ethiopia specifically and indicate that those of us who are friends of Ethiopia, friends of the Horn of Africa generally, are very hopeful that the peace agreement will hold, that the fighting remains stopped, that people are no longer dying, at least as a result of active conflict, that the Eritrean forces decide it is in their interest to pull back to Eritrea, and that, in fact, at some point, a more normal relationship can develop along that Tigrayan Eritrean border, where people can move across it without disruption, where trade goes on, and where personal relationships can be resumed and be done peacefully. That, I think, would be an enormous achievement for 2023. And I'm somewhat hopeful that at least the fighting can be um, uh, prevented over the foreseeable future.
Ambassador Shinn, thank you.
Thank you.